Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work. The great question. What's on the other side of the veil? What does shuffling off the mortal coil actually entail? Unfortunately for the curious, there really is only one way for most of us to find out. But sometimes, just sometimes, that veil ripples and affords some lucky individuals glances into the other side. Like our protagonist tonight in Matt Chatham's That Night in the Mirror. Well, to begin, I'll tell you right now that my story doesn't have any dramatic climax or any cathartic resolution. Don't bother reading it if that's what you're looking for. My story is of one very specific moment in my life. One which, try as I might, I can't negate as a trick of my exhausted brain, or a momentary lapse of reason and subsequent plunge into childish fears. I think that a fear of mirrors must be fairly common in this day and age. I remember when I was young, I saw one of those compilation TV horror shows. The ones where there'd be a different short, scary story between the commercial breaks. In retrospect, it wasn't the scariest thing in the world. And if I saw it again today, I'd probably invite friends over and we could quash our collective fear by mocking the bad acting or the ridiculous storyline. All I remember of this story is that in it, a man was being constantly tormented by a disfigured, murderous psychopath, but he only saw him when he looked in the mirror. The whole story was a typical song and dance of the man catching his stalker in the mirror behind him, of course, then turning to face him and finding nothing there. Maybe the reason that I remember it so well is because it was so shortly after that I heard my mom die. I say I heard her die because I never saw her body. I was watching TV, different show, when I heard what sounded like porcelain breaking, followed by a loud thud coming from the kitchen 2 rooms away. The sudden noise was oddly unsurprising, but I remember craning my head out the door to see my mom's legs sprawled on the tiled floor. I couldn't see any more of her at the time. The doorframe was in the way. Luckily, I suppose, my father ran in first, calling her name somewhat frantically. As I stood up, but didn't advance out of what I imagined was fear, I remember him telling me to stay where I was. The doctors told us that a virus had somehow gotten into her heart. I remember my father protesting that he hadn't even heard of that before. Neither had I, but truthfully, the concept of death itself was fairly new to me at the time. And I remember being filled with an overwhelming sense of existential fear, as if I or anyone that I knew could suddenly crumble into a lifeless pile of dust at any moment. I don't think I was a particularly fearful child, though. No more so than most, anyway. And even my uneasiness around mirrors didn't exactly trump my other fears of spiders or being in cramped spaces, for instance. I guess it makes sense that mirrors are a source of fear for people. One of the defining signs, supposedly, of self-awareness is whether or not an animal recognizes itself in the mirror. Maybe we still retain some primal belief that what we're seeing really isn't us, but some sinister shadow self, not to mention all the scenes in horror movies that use them. A character will bend down to splash water in their face, and when they lift their head back up, their face is distorted in some gruesome and horrific way. That night, I had just gotten home from a party at a nearby frat house. I lived in an old Victorian house that 4 of my friends from school and I rented. I was the only one home at the time, having left the party early. Well, if you can call 2 o'clock in the morning early. And my roommates were all still out. I ran upstairs to my room, exhausted and wanting nothing more than to lay in my bed and feel the rest of the world leave me behind. but I didn't. In rare form, I decided that night to take a few more steps down the hall to the old, poorly designed bathroom that two of my roommates shared with me. It was lit by a single fluorescent bulb and cast the black and white tile in a sickly near-green color. I ran a thin strip of toothpaste on my brush and gave my teeth a once-over before spitting the slightly brown spit and foam down the sink. When I looked up, I saw her. Standing behind me in the bathtub, with the curtain drawn wide open, was my mother. Her mouth hung down as if screaming, but without any sound. I could tell it was Mom, but she was a grotesque shadow of how I remembered her. Her eyes were either completely gone or simply black in color. The sockets were vacuums within which nothing reflected. Her skin was so pale it was almost blue, and her dark hair looked drenched in water, hugging her scalp tight and falling in front of her shoulders in thin strips. Her mouth, I guess, wasn't exactly screaming so much as hanging open, impossibly open, much further than a person's jaw should be able to extend. She seemed to be wearing a thin white nightgown, drenched like her hair, and clinging to her emaciated body. Her stick-thin legs looked like they were going to buckle under her weight while her arms reached back against the wall. I must have seen her only for a second before turning, screaming and falling backwards, slamming hard into the tiled floor. The tub, of course, was empty. There had been no sound, and now as the echoes of my cry dissipated, I could only hear my heavy breathing. I don't know how long I lay there on the floor of the bathroom, the fluorescent bulb dully buzzing as I became too frightened to even move. Eventually I heard the downstairs door swing open as a parade of drunk college guys and their floozies poured in for the night. They found me on the floor and thought it was hilarious I was so drunk I almost passed out in the bathroom, of course. As for Mother, I never saw her again. I never want to see her again, and every day I wish I hadn't seen her to begin with. There are myths of people being scared to death or being haunted by dreams of a single event for their whole lives. I've had dreams too, but they aren't what haunts me to this very day. When someone that you love dies, you tend to forget everything bad about them, and eventually your memories of them just coalesce into a fondness that you share with everyone else that knew them. But that's not how I feel about my mother. I was too young when she died to have endless loving stories about her. Instead, all I can remember is her face that night in the mirror. My story doesn't end with me taking my own life or anything dramatic like that. I have thought about it, though. I tried putting a length of rope across my neck one day and squeezing just to see what it would feel like. I'd never go through with it, though. It's not so much that I want to live. What bothers me the most is that I don't know for sure what happens when we die. Nobody does. But what I saw that night in the mirror, well, that makes me think I do. It may be that one of humanity's oldest fears is that of the unknown, but that doesn't mean it can't be made worse by just that one little glimpse. Stay scary, my wildlings. Keep your shower curtains closed and make the most of your nights.